The radio crackles with urgency as the night swallows the last light over Henderson Field. The date is October 12, 1942. Sergeant William Hicks of the 7th Marine Ammunition Company crouches in the damp soil, his dark hands working with practiced precision as he twists the final strand of wire between two coconut husks. His breathing is controlled but labored in the oppressive jungle heat of Guadalcanal. 20 yards away, Private Marcus Coleman keeps watch, finger hovering near the trigger of his Springfield rifle, eyes straining against the growing darkness. 10 minutes, Sarge, Coleman whispers, his Georgia accent barely audible above the symphony of jungle insects. Hicks nods without looking up, his focus unwavering as he secures the last connection in an intricate web of wires, coconut shells, and trip mechanisms that stretches across a narrow jungle pathway. This crude but ingenious system isn't in any Marine Corps manual. It wasn't taught at Montford Point Camp where he and the other black Marines had trained. This was something entirely of his own design, born of desperation, necessity, and the mechanical aptitude that had earned him little more than janitorial work back in Philadelphia. "We've got movement," Coleman hisses, dropping lower behind the massive trunk of a banyan tree. Hicks freezes, then slowly sinks into the undergrowth, becoming invisible in the darkness. His creation, what the men of his unit had come to call the coconut wire, was about to be tested against the Japanese scouts who had been infiltrating their lines for weeks, gathering intelligence that had cost dozens of American lives. No one in the 21st Defense Battalion knew that one man's improvised trap that night would rewrite battlefield history and save Henderson Field from a surprise attack that might have reversed the entire course of the Pacific War. What they did know was that Sergeant William Hicks had defied orders by leaving his assigned ammunition supply post to set this trap, an act that could end with a court-martial if it failed, or perhaps merely a reprimand if it succeeded. What no one could have predicted was how 20 Japanese scouts would seem to simply vanish into the jungle, changing the strategic balance on an island where every advantage meant the difference between life and death. The sun had not yet risen over the mountains of Guadalcanal, but already the day promised the same suffocating heat and humidity that had greeted William Hicks every morning since landing on this God-forsaken island 2 months earlier. He sat on his cot, carefully polishing his boots, a habit he maintained despite the futility of keeping anything clean in this environment. It was a ritual that connected him to a sense of order in the chaos of war. Born in 1918 in the small town of Macon, Georgia, Hicks had learned early about both order and chaos. The son of a carpenter, he had inherited his father's methodical approach to problems and his mechanical intuition. By the age of 12, he could fix almost anything with an engine, a skill that earned him steady work, even during the worst years of the Depression. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Hicks had been working as a mechanic in Philadelphia, having moved north like many Southern black men seeking better opportunities. At 23, he was among the first wave of African Americans to enlist after President Roosevelt's executive order 8802 opened military service to all Americans regardless of race. The Marines wouldn't take colored men. He had told his mother when she asked why he didn't choose the army like his cousins. "Until now, I want to be first at something." What he couldn't have known then was how bittersweet that distinction would be. Training at Montford Point Camp near Camp Lejeune had been a crucible unlike anything he had experienced before. The black recruits faced not only the legendary rigors of Marine Corps training, but also the added burden of proving themselves worthy of wearing the uniform. "They didn't think we could fight," Hicks would later recall to the men in his unit. "They gave us ammunition to carry instead of rifles to fire." Indeed, the Montford Point Marines were primarily assigned to ammunition and depot companies, service units tasked with supplying the front lines rather than fighting on them. But drill instructor Sergeant Gilbert Hashmark Johnson had instilled in them a fierce pride and determination. "You will be better than any Marine at New River," Johnson had told them, "because you have to be." Hicks had taken those words to heart, finishing at the top of his class in every technical aspect of training. His mechanical background made him a natural for the complex logistics of ammunition supply, and by the time his unit was assigned to support operations at Guadalcanal in August 1942, He had already been promoted to sergeant. The 7th Marine Ammunition Company arrived at Guadalcanal 3 weeks after the initial landings. The 1st Marine Division had already secured Henderson Field, the strategic airstrip that would become the focal point of the campaign. Hicks and his men were immediately put to work, moving ammunition from the beach to supply depots near the airfield perimeter. It was grueling work under brutal conditions. The threat of Japanese air raids meant they often worked through the night, hauling crates of mortar shells, machine gun belts, and rifle ammunition through muddy jungle trails. Malaria and dysentery tore through their ranks. Food was scarce and often infested with maggots, but perhaps the most difficult challenge was the isolation. We were Marines, but not really. Private Marcus Coleman, Hicks's closest friend in the unit, would later say, "White units didn't want us near them except when they needed bullets. We ate separately, slept separately, died separately." Despite these conditions, the men of the 7th performed their duties with distinction. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, would later note that without the ammunition companies, the rifles and machine guns of the infantry would have fallen silent at the most critical moments. But Sergeant William Hicks wanted to contribute more than just his back and arms. His opportunity would come in early October, when Japanese infiltrators began to take a deadly toll on Marine operations. By the second week of October 1942, Japanese scout units had established effective infiltration routes through the dense jungle surrounding the American perimeter. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would slip through gaps in the defensive lines, observe troop movements and supply locations, then exfiltrate with valuable intelligence. This information allowed Japanese artillery to target ammunition dumps with devastating accuracy. On October 10th, a direct hit on an ammunition cache killed 17 Marines and destroyed enough ammunition to supply a battalion for a week. Among the dead were 2 men from Hicks's company. "They know exactly where to hit us," Lieutenant James Whitmore told his platoon leaders after the attack. "Someone's getting close enough to see our operations." Official response focused on increasing perimeter patrols and adding machine gun positions. But Hicks had another idea. Having grown up hunting in the woods of Georgia, he understood that conventional defenses wouldn't work against an enemy that moved like a ghost through dense jungle. "You don't catch a fox with a fence," he told Coleman that evening. "You catch him with a trap." For 3 nights, Hicks observed Japanese infiltration patterns, identifying a narrow ravine that seemed to be their preferred route through Marine lines. On the 4th night, he approached Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan with his plan. "With respect, sir, I think I can stop those scouts," he said, standing stiffly at attention outside Donovan's tent. Donovan, a Boston-born veteran who had seen combat at Wake Island, looked up from his paperwork with skepticism. "And how exactly would you do that, Sergeant?" Hicks explained his idea, an elaborate system of tripwires connected to coconut husks filled with small rocks. When triggered, the system would create noise that would alert Marines without giving away defensive positions. It might not stop determined infiltrators, but it would deny them the element of surprise. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard," Donovan said after a long pause. "And even if it worked, Lieutenant Ross would never approve it. Your job is ammunition supply, not setting booby traps." "Men are dying because these scouts are getting through," Hicks persisted. "My men." Donovan's expression softened slightly. "Look, Hicks, you're a good Marine, one of my best, but this isn't your responsibility. The infantry will handle perimeter security. You handle ammunition, that's an order." Hicks nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." But that night, after completing his regular duties, Hicks gathered materials for his trap. Coleman caught him collecting wire from a supply crate. "What are you doing, Will?" he asked, using Hicks's first name as he only did when they were alone. "What needs to be done?" Hicks replied without looking up. Coleman watched him for a moment. "You're going to get court-martialed." "Maybe." Hicks finally met his friend's eyes. "You going to report me?" Coleman sighed. "Hell no, I'm going to help you." What began as a simple early warning system evolved over the next 2 days into something far more sophisticated. Using his mechanical knowledge and improvising with available materials, Hicks created a network of triggers and counterweights that could be activated by the slightest pressure on nearly invisible tripwires. But instead of being connected to explosives, these wires activated another system, what would later become known as the coconut wire. Coconuts were abundant on the island, and the fibrous husks, when dried and hollowed, could be filled with small objects. Hicks created dozens of these containers, filling them with fish hooks, small pebbles, and broken glass. These were suspended from tree branches by vines and connected to the tripwire system. When triggered, the coconut husks would swing down at various heights along the narrow ravine path. The genius of the system was its virtually silent operation. Unlike mines or flares that would alert the targets, the coconut wire would incapacitate infiltrators before they realized they were caught. The swinging husks, traveling at surprising speed on their vine pendulums, would strike at face and neck level, dispersing their contents in a shower of hooks and sharp debris. On the night of October 12th, Hicks and Coleman completed their work and waited in concealed positions near the trap. The official perimeter patrols had been deliberately spaced to leave this area less guarded, part of a strategy to channel enemy infiltrators into predictable paths. What the Marine commanders didn't know was that Sergeant Hicks had turned this pathway into a deadly gauntlet. At 11:17 p.m., exactly what Hicks had anticipated occurred. A team of Japanese scouts, moving with practiced stealth, entered the narrow ravine. The lead scout, an experienced sergeant from the Imperial Japanese Army's elite reconnaissance regiment, noticed nothing unusual as he led his men forward, until the first tripwire. The trap performed even better than Hicks had designed. The lead scouts triggered multiple coconut containers simultaneously, creating a sudden storm of hooks and sharp objects. The natural reaction, to recoil and raise hands to protect the face, triggered secondary wires that activated more swinging projectiles. Within seconds, the entire scout unit was entangled in a web of wires, thrashing as barbed hooks caught in clothing and flesh. Hicks had positioned a final element at the far end of the ravine, a simple alarm made from mess tins that would sound if anyone tried to retreat from the trap. When this alarm rang, it signaled to Hicks and Coleman to approach from their hidden positions. What happened next would later be described in hushed tones among the men of the 7th Ammunition Company. Hicks and Coleman, using only knives and their sidearms, neutralized the entire Japanese reconnaissance unit, 20 men in total, in near-complete silence. The combination of surprise, the disabling effect of the trap, and the two Marines' decisive action resulted in what one officer would later call the most effective small unit ambush of the Pacific Campaign. By dawn, Hicks and Coleman had removed all evidence of the engagement, including the bodies of the Japanese scouts. When questioned later about the sudden disappearance of enemy infiltration activity, they claimed no knowledge, but suggested that perhaps the increased perimeter patrols had discouraged the Japanese. For 3 days, the Japanese command structure on Guadalcanal waited for intelligence that never came. Without updated information on Marine positions and supply concentrations, a planned artillery barrage followed by a night attack on Henderson Field had to be postponed, then finally abandoned. This delay gave recently arrived American reinforcements critical time to strengthen defensive positions around the airfield. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when a patrol from the 5th Marines discovered a hastily dug mass grave containing the bodies of 20 Japanese soldiers, all bearing unusual injuries consistent with Hicks's trap, that questions began to be asked. By then, the strategic moment had passed, and the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had begun their slow retreat. Lieutenant James Ross, who had explicitly ordered Hicks to focus solely on ammunition supply, was furious when he connected the dots. He immediately summoned Hicks to his command post near Henderson Field. "Sergeant, do you want to explain to me exactly what you were doing the night of October 12th? Ross demanded, his face flushed with anger. Hicks stood at rigid attention. "Securing ammunition supply lines, sir. Don't play games with me, Sergeant. I know about your little hunting expedition. You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir, I did." Ross hadn't expected such a frank admission. He studied the black sergeant's impassive face. "You realize I could have you court-martialed? Reduced in rank at the very least?" "Yes, sir." "So why did you do it?" Hicks finally met his commanding officer's eyes. "Because it needed doing, sir, and because I could." What happened next would change Hicks's life. Instead of pressing charges, Ross brought the incident to the attention of Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, and architect of the defense of Bloody Ridge. Edson, who had a reputation for valuing results over protocol, was intrigued by Hicks's improvised trap system. "I want to meet this sergeant," Edson told Ross, "and I want to see how his contraption works." On October 30th, 1942, Sergeant William Hicks found himself demonstrating his coconut wire trap to a group of senior officers, including Colonel Edson and Major Kenneth Bailey. Using a clearing behind the Marine lines, Hicks reconstructed the system and explained its operation in detailed technical terms. "The principle is simple, sir," he said as the officers examined the mechanism. "When the primary wire is tripped, it releases tension on this vine, which allows the counterweight to drop. That pulls this secondary line, which releases all of these containers simultaneously." Edson nodded thoughtfully. "And you came up with this entirely on your own, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir, based on some snare techniques I learned growing up, adapted for the jungle." Bailey, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, was particularly impressed. "This could be adapted for wider application, multiple killing zones, perhaps even integrated with our existing defensive wire." Edson agreed. "Lieutenant Ross tells me you have a background in mechanics." "Yes, sir. I worked as an automobile mechanic before enlisting." "And yet you're hauling ammunition crates." Hicks remained silent, his expression carefully neutral. Edson turned to Ross. "I want this man assigned to my staff effective immediately. We need to document this system and implement it along the western perimeter." Ross began to protest. "Sir, with respect, we're already short-handed in the ammunition companies. This sergeant just eliminated 20 enemy infiltrators and quite possibly saved Henderson Field in the process," Edson interrupted. "I think that's worth more than his muscle on ammunition detail, don't you?" And so on November 1st, 1942, Sergeant William Hicks was temporarily attached to the 1st Raider Battalion as a defensive systems specialist, a title created specifically for him. Over the next 3 weeks, he supervised the installation of modified versions of his trap system at key infiltration points around the Marine perimeter. Japanese reconnaissance activities dropped to nearly zero during this period. More significantly, Hicks was given the opportunity to train other Marines in his techniques, working alongside white troops in a capacity that went far beyond the limited support role originally envisioned for black Marines. This small breach in the rigid segregation of military units represented a minor but meaningful step toward the integration that would eventually transform the armed forces. When the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved on Guadalcanal in December 1942, Sergeant Hicks returned to his original unit. There was no official recognition of his contributions, no medals or commendations that might have acknowledged the lives his initiative had saved. The story of the coconut wire trap became something of a legend among the Montford Point Marines, passed down through the ranks, but rarely shared outside their tight-knit community. After the war, William Hicks returned to Philadelphia, where he opened a small but successful auto repair shop. He rarely spoke of his experiences on Guadalcanal, even to his family. Like many veterans of his generation, and particularly black veterans who returned to a nation still deeply divided by segregation, he focused on building a future rather than dwelling on the past. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 50 years after the events on Guadalcanal, that Hicks's story began to emerge into wider awareness. A Marine Corps historian, researching the contributions of Montford Point Marines to the Pacific Campaign, discovered references to the coconut wire incident in the personal papers of Colonel Edson, who had died in 1955. Further investigation led to Hicks himself, by then 94 years old but still sharp of mind. In a series of interviews, he recounted the details of his improvised trap system and its effectiveness against Japanese infiltrators. His matter-of-fact description of the technical aspects was interspersed with more philosophical reflections on his experiences as one of the first black Marines. "We weren't fighting for recognition," he told the historian. "We were fighting to prove we belonged, that we could think as well as work, that we could lead as well as follow." In 2012, when President Barack Obama awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Montford Point Marines, William Hicks was among the surviving veterans honored at the ceremony. The citation acknowledged not only their service under difficult conditions, but also their individual acts of courage and innovation that had often gone unrecognized. The coconut wire trap of Sergeant William Hicks stands as a testament to the resourcefulness born of necessity and the contributions that were possible when artificial barriers of race were temporarily set aside in the crucible of combat. It reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that the history of warfare, like the history of our nation, is composed of many voices and perspectives, some of which are only now being fully heard. The exact number of lives saved by Hicks's invention can never be precisely calculated, but military historians have suggested that the elimination of those 20 Japanese scouts on October 12, 1942 likely prevented an attack that could have compromised Henderson Field at a critical juncture in the Guadalcanal campaign. Had the airfield fallen back into Japanese hands, the entire strategic balance in the South Pacific might have shifted, potentially extending the war by months or even years. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal on October 13, 1942, Sergeant William Hicks and Private Marcus Coleman made their way back to their unit, carrying nothing but their standard equipment and the quiet knowledge of what they had accomplished. They left behind no evidence of their presence, only the absence of 20 enemy scouts who would never return to their lines. "You think anyone will ever know what happened here?" Coleman asked as they neared the American perimeter. Hicks looked back toward the ravine, now peaceful in the early morning light. "Someone will figure it out eventually," he said, "but that's not why we did it." "Why did we do it then?" "Because we're Marines," Hicks replied simply, "and Marines do what needs doing." The Japanese commander who had sent those scouts to gather intelligence for the planned attack on Henderson Field would wait in vain for their return. Without the critical information they were meant to provide, he would be forced to delay, then ultimately abandon, an operation that might have turned the tide of battle on Guadalcanal. In official Japanese records, the fate of that reconnaissance unit would be listed with a single phrase: "Failed to return, presumed lost." But on the American side of the lines, the sudden cessation of accurate Japanese artillery fire was noted with puzzlement and relief. Supply dumps remained intact, casualties decreased, the defensive perimeter held. Small advantages accumulated into a decisive edge that would eventually secure victory on the island that one war correspondent called Green Hell. And through it all, Sergeant William Hicks continued to perform his assigned duties, moving ammunition, maintaining equipment, leading his men with quiet authority. The coconut wire trap was neither his first nor his last innovation during the war, but it was perhaps his most consequential, a moment when one man's initiative and courage changed the course of battle, and with it perhaps the course of history. 75 years later, a small exhibit at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia includes a reproduction of the coconut wire trap created from Hicks's detailed descriptions and technical drawings. Beside it is a photograph of Sergeant Hicks in his dress blues, taken shortly before his discharge in 1945. His expression is serious, dignified, proud, the face of a man who knows his own worth, regardless of whether that worth is recognized by others. The exhibit's simple caption reads, "Innovation in Combat, the Coconut Wire Trap of Sergeant William Hicks, USMC. Guadalcanal, October 1942. It stands as a reminder that courage takes many forms in warfare, not only the courage to charge forward into gunfire, but also the courage to think differently, to act independently when necessary, to risk censure in service of a greater good, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to believe in one's own capabilities when others might doubt. On the wall nearby, I quote from Hicks himself, recorded during those interviews in 1992, offers a fitting epitaph for both the man and his invention. There are no segregated ideas in combat. There are only those that work and those that don't. Mine worked. In the years that followed the Guadalcanal campaign, the strategic significance of Hicks's invention would be debated by military historians and tacticians. Some would argue that the elimination of 20 enemy scouts, while impressive, represented only a minor tactical victory in the broader context of the war. Others would point to the timing, how the disruption of Japanese intelligence gathering came at precisely the moment when accurate information might have enabled a successful assault on Henderson Field. What cannot be debated is the ripple effect of Hicks's initiative. His temporary assignment to Colonel Edson's staff led to the implementation of similar trap systems throughout the Marine defensive perimeter. These systems were later adapted for use in other campaigns across the Pacific, evolving into standard doctrine for perimeter security in jungle environments. More significantly, Hicks's demonstration of technical ingenuity challenged prevailing assumptions about the roles appropriate for Black Marines. While full integration of the armed forces would not come until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, small breaches in the wall of segregation, moments when skill and ability transcended racial barriers, helped pave the way for that eventual transformation. After his return from Guadalcanal, Hicks was promoted to Staff Sergeant and assigned to train new recruits at Montford Point. There, he was able to pass on not only technical skills, but also a philosophy that would influence a generation of Black Marines, that excellence was its own argument for equality. "They can deny you recognition," he would tell his trainees. "They can deny you opportunity, but they cannot deny you excellence once you have achieved it." After his discharge in 1945, Hicks returned to a nation still deeply divided along racial lines. The GI Bill that helped millions of white veterans pursue education and home ownership was implemented unevenly, with Black veterans often denied its full benefits. But Hicks had saved enough of his military pay to make a down payment on a small garage in North Philadelphia, which he transformed into Hicks Auto Repair. The business thrived, building a reputation for honest work and technical expertise. By 1955, Hicks employed 5 mechanics and had expanded to a larger location. He married Eleanor Washington, a former WEC, Women's Army Corps member, in 1947. And together they raised 3 children, all of whom would attend college, an opportunity Hicks himself never had. Throughout these post-war years, Hicks maintained connections with other Montford Point veterans, participating in informal reunions and support networks. These men, who had served their country with distinction despite institutional discrimination, formed a brotherhood bound by shared experience and mutual respect. It was at one such gathering in 1967 that Hicks first met Robert Truman, a young Marine Corps historian researching the experiences of Black Marines in World War II. Their conversation, brief but substantive, planted a seed that would eventually grow into a fuller exploration of Hicks's wartime innovations. He wasn't interested in personal glory, Truman would later write. He spoke of his coconut wire trap as a simple solution to a practical problem, not as some great invention. But when I pressed him on details, his eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a born engineer, and he sketched the mechanism on a cocktail napkin with remarkable precision. That sketch, preserved in Truman's papers, would eventually find its way to the Marine Corps archives, where it remained largely forgotten until the broader re-evaluation of Montford Point Marines' contributions began in the 1990s. By then, Hicks had retired from active management of his auto repair business, turning it over to his son, William Jr. His health remained relatively good into his 80s, allowing him to enjoy his grandchildren and to occasionally speak at local schools about his wartime experiences, though he typically focused on the broader history of the Montford Point Marines rather than his personal accomplishments. In 1992, the more comprehensive interviews with Marine Corps historians finally documented the full story of the coconut wire trap and its significance. These interviews coincided with increased recognition of the Montford Point Marines as a vital part of Marine Corps heritage. When asked during these interviews why he had risked court-martial by disobeying orders to create his trap system, Hicks's answer reflected both the pragmatism and the moral clarity that had guided his actions 50 years earlier. "There's a difference between orders and purpose," he said. "My orders were to move ammunition, but my purpose, our purpose, was to win the war. Sometimes you have to choose between the letter of your orders and the spirit of your mission. This philosophy, that initiative and moral courage sometimes require independent action, would later be incorporated into Marine Corps leadership training, though rarely with attribution to its source. Like many innovations that originated with marginalized groups, The principle was absorbed into institutional wisdom without acknowledgement of its origins. William Hicks passed away peacefully in his sleep on June 12, 2007, at the age of 89. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a contingent of Marines, including several general officers. The Commandant of the Marine Corps sent a personal letter of condolence to the family, acknowledging Hicks's contributions to the Corps and to the nation. 3 years after his death, when Marine Corps historians completed a comprehensive review of the Guadalcanal campaign for its 70th anniversary, the significance of Hicks's coconut wire trap received formal recognition in official histories. Analysis of Japanese war records had revealed that the reconnaissance unit eliminated by Hicks and Coleman had been tasked with gathering final intelligence for a major assault on Henderson Field, scheduled for October 15, 1942. This assault, involving elements of the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division supported by tanks, never materialized, in large part because the commanding general, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, lacked the specific information on Marine positions that his scouts had been sent to obtain. Instead, Japanese forces conducted a more generalized attack that was repulsed with heavy losses. Military historians now generally agree that had the original, more targeted attack proceeded as planned, Henderson Field might well have been temporarily recaptured. This would have severely compromised American air support in the region at a critical juncture, potentially allowing Japanese naval forces to regain control of the waters around Guadalcanal. In this light, the impromptu action of 2 black Marines, men who had been relegated to support roles based on their race rather than their abilities, may have helped preserve a pivotal American foothold in the South Pacific. Their story stands as a testament to the often unseen and unsung contributions that shape the outcome of battles and wars. Today, as the Marine Corps continues to evolve and to reckon with its own history, the legacy of William Hicks and the Montford Point Marines offers important lessons about innovation, initiative, and the untapped potential that exists when artificial barriers are removed. It reminds us that courage and ingenuity can emerge from unexpected quarters, and that the strength of a fighting force, like the strength of a nation, lies in its ability to recognize and cultivate talent wherever it exists. The coconut wire trap of Sergeant William Hicks was more than a clever battlefield improvisation. It was a demonstration of what becomes possible when skill and opportunity converge, when individuals are judged not by preconceptions but by performance, not by limitations imposed from without, but by excellence achieved from within. In a broader sense, it serves as a metaphor for the journey of black Americans in military service, a journey marked by obstacles and prejudice, but also by perseverance, achievement, and gradual recognition. Like Hicks himself, that journey combined practical problem-solving with moral courage, technical ingenuity with human resilience. Would you have broken the rules to save your fellow Marines? Would you have risked court-martial to do what you knew was right? These are the questions that the story of William Hicks and his coconut wire trap pose to each of us, questions about courage, initiative, and the sometimes complex relationship between obedience and effectiveness in combat. Share this story so others can remember what true courage means, not just the physical bravery to face enemy fire, but the moral courage to act independently when lives hang in the balance, and the intellectual courage to imagine solutions where none seem to exist. In these qualities, the legacy of Sergeant William Hicks and the Montford Point Marines continues to inspire and instruct, 75 years after they made history on a distant island in the South Pacific.